She had no idea I'd spent the last 8 months learning to read Korean. My daughter invited me to her firm's client dinner, a group of Korean tech investors she'd been courting for months. She called it a family touch. Said it would warm things up if her father was there. I believed her. I still wanted to believe her then. I'm 68 years old. My name is Robert. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, built bridges across 4 states, raised 2 kids in a house my wife Gloria and I picked out together in 1987, a split level in Naperville, Illinois, with a big oak tree in the backyard that my son's to climb until he was too old to admit he still wanted to. Gloria passed 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. The house still smells like her sometimes, early in the morning when I haven't opened the windows yet. I've never been able to explain that, and I've stopped trying. After Gloria died, my daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is. Even now, she stepped in. She called every other day. She drove up on weekends. She said things like, "Dad, you don't have to do this alone," and I thought she meant it. I think part of her did at first. But grief has a way of revealing people slowly, the way cold weather reveals cracks in concrete. You don't see them in the warmth. You only see them when the temperature drops. Her husband, my son-in-law, is a corporate attorney. Sharp, careful with words the way surgeons are careful with hands. He always had an answer before you finished your question. I liked him once. I told Gloria he reminded me of myself at that age, driven, confident, maybe a little too certain that he understood the room. She laughed and said, "That's either a compliment or a warning." She was usually right about people. 6 months after the funeral, my son-in-law started talking about the house. Not directly. He never did anything directly. It was always a question shaped like concern. "Dad, have you thought about what happens if you need more support down the road? Or, some of those financial instruments Gloria had, have you had a chance to review them with anyone?" He said he could connect me with someone, a financial advisor, a friend of his from law school. Real convenient. I smiled and said I'd think about it. I did think about it, just not in the direction he expected. Here's what nobody tells you about losing your wife of 39 years. You get quiet in a way that people mistake for confusion. They see a man sitting alone at his kitchen table and they think he's lost. Sometimes he is, but sometimes he's just thinking. Sometimes he's paying very close attention. I started noticing things. A folder missing from Gloria's filing cabinet. She kept everything organized, bless her. Medical records, insurance policies, the deed to the house. I found it 2 weeks later under a stack of my son-in-law's papers in the guest room. He said he'd borrowed it to help me get my estate documents in order. I said thank you. I took a picture of every page before I put it back. Then there was the conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. It was a Sunday. I'd come in from the backyard, and they didn't hear me through the screen door. My daughter was on the phone. I could only hear her side, and she was talking about the timeline and whether he'd signed before the end of the quarter. I stood there for about 30 seconds. Long enough. I didn't say anything that afternoon. I made coffee. I asked about the grandkids. I watched my son-in-law pour himself a second glass of wine and talk about interest rates, and I thought, I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I make a single move. Now here's the part that matters. Gloria had always wanted to learn Korean. She'd read about the culture, watched cooking shows, even bought a couple of language books she kept on the nightstand. She never got the chance to use them. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to move those books for almost a year. They just sat there, her reading glasses folded on top of them. One morning I picked one up. I'm not sure why. Maybe I just wanted to touch something she'd touched. But I opened it, and I started reading, and something in me decided I was going to finish what she started. I hired a tutor, a retired professor at the community college, a woman named Dr. Shin, who had the patience of a saint and the directness of a drill sergeant. We met twice a week in her office. I told her I was a widower who wanted to honor his wife's memory. That was true. I didn't tell her the rest. 8 months. I'm not fluent. I want to be honest about that. But I can follow a conversation. I understand more than I can produce. Enough, as it turned out, to understand every word spoken at that dinner table in the private room of a Korean restaurant in downtown Chicago, while my daughter sat across from me, assuming I was just a quiet old man who was grateful to be included. The investors had flown in from Seoul, 4 of them, polite, formal, clearly experienced at these client dinners. My daughter and son-in-law were working on a commercial real estate deal, and these men had capital my son-in-law's firm wanted badly. My daughter had positioned herself as the relationship manager. She spoke no Korean. She didn't know that mattered. What she didn't know was that after the appetizers, after the first round of soju, 2 of the investors began talking to each other in Korean about the deal, not about the terms, but about the people across the table. That's a different kind of conversation. That's where the truth is. I sat with my hands in my lap and listened. They said my daughter seemed capable, but that her husband was pushing too hard. One of them said in Korean, "The father looks like a decent man. It's a shame." The other one laughed, not a cruel laugh, but the kind that means he understood exactly what was meant. A shame. I turned that phrase over in my mind and kept eating my japchae. Later, when the conversation shifted back to English, one of the investors glanced at me and asked politely whether I had any involvement in the business. My daughter jumped in. "Oh, Dad's retired. He's just here for the company," and waved him off like I was a piece of furniture she'd brought for atmosphere. I set down my chopsticks. I looked at the investor who had asked, and I said in Korean, slowly, carefully, but correctly, "I was a civil engineer for 30 years. I know how to read a structure, and I know when one has been built on a weak foundation." The table went very quiet. The investor stared at me. Then he smiled. Genuinely. The first real smile I'd seen all evening. He responded in Korean. We spoke for about 2 minutes. My daughter's face went through about 11 different expressions during those 2 minutes. My son-in-law's face went through just one, and it wasn't pleasant. After dinner in the parking garage, my daughter grabbed my arm. "What was that?" she said. "What was what?" "You spoke Korean. Since when do you speak Korean?" "Since about 8 months ago," I said. "Your mother had those books on the nightstand. I figured I'd put them to use." She didn't say anything for a moment. I could see her recalculating. "Dad, I don't know what you think you heard, but I think we should talk about the house," I said, "and the power of attorney documents your husband had drafted, and the financial advisor from his law school, the one who happened to specialize in elder estate planning. I think we should talk about all of it, but not tonight. Tonight I'm tired." I drove home alone. I sat in the driveway for a while before I went inside. Here's what I had by that point. I had photographs of every document that had gone through my guest room. I had a recording legal in Illinois, which is a one-party consent state, of a conversation from 3 weeks prior in which my son-in-law explained to someone on the phone how a revocable trust could be structured to manage Dad's assets going forward without triggering any flags. I had a letter drafted by his firm, which I had found, scanned, and returned before he knew it was missing, that outlined a plan to transfer primary decision-making over my estate to a family trust, with him as trustee. What I didn't have yet was an attorney. I fixed that the next morning. Her name was Patricia Alderman. She'd been recommended to me by a man I'd worked with for 12 years on a county infrastructure project, a man who had no connection to my son-in-law's world whatsoever. I walked into her office on a Tuesday morning with a manila folder, sat down across from her, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the documents and was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Robert," she said, she called me that throughout, "you've done something unusual here. Most people in your situation don't have documentation this clean." "I built bridges for 30 years, I said. "You document everything before you pour the concrete." She smiled at that. What followed was not fast. "I want to be honest about that too, because I've heard these stories where everything resolves in a single dramatic moment, and that's not how it works. It took 4 months. There were letters and counter-letters. There were tense conversations that I was not present for. There was a mediation session in a beige conference room where my son-in-law sat across a table and tried for about 40 minutes to explain that everything had been done out of love and concern for my well-being. I let him finish. Then I handed Patricia a copy of the recorded phone call. He stopped explaining after that. The power of attorney documents were never filed. The trust structure was dissolved before it was finalized. My son-in-law's firm, upon learning of the situation, quietly reassigned him to a different practice area. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask. My daughter called me 2 weeks after the mediation. She was crying, real crying, not performance. I've known her long enough to tell the difference. She said she didn't realize how far it had gone. She said her husband had told her it was all routine estate planning. She said she should have asked more questions. I listened. I didn't say anything for a while. "Mom would have asked questions," I finally said. She cried harder at that. I didn't say it to wound her. It was just true. We're not fixed. I want to be clear about that too. She calls once a week now. Sometimes it feels like before, and sometimes it feels like two people being careful with each other across a distance that wasn't there before. Maybe that distance closes over time. Maybe it doesn't close all the way. I don't know yet. What I know is this: I still live in my house. The oak tree is still in the backyard. I still wake up some mornings to the faint smell of Gloria's hand lotion in the curtains, and I still can't explain it, and I've stopped trying. On what would have been our 40th anniversary, I drove to the community college and knocked on Dr. Shin's office door. I told her I wanted to keep going with the lessons. She asked me why, not skeptically, just curious. I told her my wife had wanted to learn, that I'd started for her and kept going for myself. That language I'd found was a strange thing. It didn't just let you understand words. It let you understand what people thought you couldn't hear. Dr. Shin nodded slowly. She said in Korean, "Then let's not waste time." I sat down and opened the book. There's a line from a Korean proverb that Dr. Shin taught me early on. It translates roughly to this: The tree that survives the winter is not the one that grows the fastest. It's the one that put down the deepest roots. Gloria put down roots in me for 39 years. I didn't know how deep they went until the cold came, now I do.